Aled Jones. So Aled Jones is the inaugural director of the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia, Ruskin University. Amongst his fellow speakers of this session, he has a chair of a working group for the Capital Markets Initiative, and that was on behalf of the Department of Climate and Department of Energy and Climate Science. So Aled, the floor is yours.
And I feel a little bit like an imposter because I used to be a mathematician. So I was at Cavendish doing astrophysics and then a fellow at maths at Cambridge. I now, for the last 14 years, have run a social science and humanities research institute at the other university in Cambridge, obviously the first university in Cambridge, Anglia Ruskin. So I've been there for 14 years. We set up this institute, the Global Sustainability Institute, to try and understand how change happens. And essentially, how do people use knowledge to create a better world, to try and avoid some of the big challenges around sustainability. So bringing in my mathematics background and physics background, I was really interested, after working with business and with government for a long time, how they use knowledge, what knowledge they were actually trying to find, how they interpreted it, and then what they did with it. So just before joining the GSI, to set that up, I worked at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We ran their business leadership groups. So this was with usually the Prince of Wales, as he was then, now the King, convening business leaders, convening government people to get together to talk about climate science, to talk about what needed to change in climate. Whenever there was a politician in the room, the sort of rule of thumb was, whatever knowledge they needed, if you could write it on the back of a postage stamp, it would really help. Postcards were too big, documents of with full mathematical rigour, never going to read it. So as Luke said, the Capital Markets Climate Initiative, that was run on behalf of Greg Barker, who was a big climate advocate but had no time for doing anything. And I do feel like I should have had more dogs and cats, because he did bring his little dachshund everywhere with him, meeting political leaders from all different countries, and it was all slightly disarming. I don't know if it was a deliberate ploy to get them to be slightly nervous, and then maybe they'd agree to UK climate demands. But we've heard a lot about some of the things that people are worried about bias in AI. And actually, I'm sort of going to take a little bit of a step back and talk just about generally bias in maths and how it's used and how we construct maths and modelling and information within, especially within policy making. So this is, it's actually a paper, if you Google Masters of Machinery, it's a paper that we wrote a couple of years ago as part of this Economics for Energy Innovation and Systems Transformation project that was ourselves and Cambridge and Oxford and UCL and led by the University of Exeter. So this was basically building big climate models, climate policy models around energy innovation. So currently, all our climate economic models that politicians use are very bad at looking towards the future. We train them on past data. So if you're trying to transform the world and go from something that uses fossil fuels, and then you use that data to understand how the world works, and you want to do something radically different, it's very difficult to use those models going forward. So you need to do something different. So how do you bring innovation and radical transformation into information? So the way government uses mathematical modelling, there are lots of rules for how policy advice can incorporate data. So we did a lot with the EU around better regulation guidelines. So this is how do you construct policy. The UK has the Treasury Green Book, which has been around for a long time. There are now bits in the annex which allow you to use different sorts of information, especially around systems thinking. Importantly, we're trying to get them to, I say this in a room full of mathematicians, think a little bit more qualitatively, at least to understand what the data is that you're trying to ingest into your policy, what it's actually telling you, and does it make sense? So can we have a bit more narrative and qualitative wrapping around some of the way that information is used? And there's now a little bit coming into the, at least in the appendix for the Treasury Green Book that does that. The truth about models is they do compete for policymaker attention. So when you've got MPs, ministers, and people in the Lords They don't really look at the model choice. They don't look at who's doing the design of the models. They don't look at the names of the models. They trust the people who are putting models in front of them. The people who are designing the policy engage a bit more with the model community and the model development community, but still there is a lot of trust in there and conversation in there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the big question we've tried to understand is the best maths being used for policy development? So when we use maths in this sort of arena with government to make huge decisions about new energy systems, about where pylons are going to go, about how do you create innovation policy that attracts investment into renewables, how can we get more solar, how can we get electric vehicles to be adopted by customers, are we actually using the best maths in making those decisions? In short, the answer is no. We've been doing climate change for 40 years and we've still not done anything really about it. So how do we get them to use better maths? Just as a background, so this is building on a number of very large European Union energy policy networks. So these are some of the networks that we run in the GSI. They're all funded by the European Union. There was a sort of shift about 5 to 10 years ago where the EU has been very good at funding big engineering projects. So most of the Horizon projects they had were to fund massive technology development, test those technology developments out in, as they get deployed. And then they wondered why all of the European Horizon projects were, well, all of them, but a lot of them were developing technologies that then never went anywhere. And part of that is because they didn't really understand when you take a technology and you stick it somewhere, you need to understand how it fits into the system. You need to understand how people behave, whether those are the installers, the people who deploy it, the investors that need to put money into it, but also the people who use it. So there was a shift in the Commission, which has now become societal readiness, but essentially, can we add some social science understanding into how this big technology stuff is going to be used to make it more usable, to make it more applicable, to co-design it with the people that you're actually going to be trying to implement it. So in the GSI, we run a couple of these big networks of social science and humanities, working with the STEM colleagues and with policymakers to help them understand what the purpose of these big technologies might be and how to get them more adopted and actually design them so they can be better and they can roll out much more quickly. So one of the big focus we had for the Masters and the Machinery paper was actually around the European Union. So the EAST project was funded by the UK Treasury and Department for Energy and Climate Change. So it was a 3-year project. We led on some of the consultation with the European Union around how they use maths in their policy making. So there are 3 broad constituents. So the Commission and all the Directorate Generals around energy, research, climate, environment and finance. So they're all involved in some way in judging whether a policy should be adopted, what sort of policy it is, what you're trying to avoid, whether it's in climate or in energy deployment. You've then got all the modelling groups, and these are some of the big modelling groups across Europe. Some of these models are used over and over again in policy development and in policy understanding. And then the people who try and do some of the translation in the middle, so these think tanks and NGOs, including the University of Cambridge's Institute for Sustainability Leadership, their Brussels office, Friends of the Earth, the European Climate Foundation. And there's lots of these think tanks that try and do this translation. Some of these do their own modelling, but there's this a lot of these models are run by different universities or big research institutes and think tanks. So one of the things the Commission does is try and use these models to develop policy. The way it uses models is to have a policy that it wants to look at the impact, and it knows what it's done in the past. So one of the loops they get into is when they're comparing the outcome of a new policy, they want to know the outcome of the last policy, so they're very wedded to some of these models. So the European Commission will use times more than it uses anything else because it's always used it. And it's never questioned the assumptions that goes into times. And so when it tests the policy it's doing, it knows what test outcomes it's looking for because it knows what the times output gives it. So the people inside the Commission are very used to being comfortable with dealing with the same people and the same outputs. They know what the graph looks like, they know what the data looks like, they know how to interpret that. So this lot in the middle try and do a bit more translation, and then the Commission funds loads of other models through these Horizon programs. They do different things. They try and use agent-based modeling, they try and use AI, they try and use systems thinking. We've been involved in developing a couple of these. There's a MEDIAS model in there around future energy innovation systems. So the Commission spends, through its research program, millions of euros every year developing new models. The Commission never uses any of those models because it uses the same model that's always used over and over again. So the way it does policy appraisal, it's got these better regulation guidelines. There are a particular number of, so you've got the models and the maths that goes into the models, and then you've got the mathematical analysis of the outputs. So, simple cost-benefit analysis, two slightly more sophisticated, which the European Union do use, multi-criteria analysis, but they're essentially equations and spreadsheets that you stick the model output into to interpret whether it should be a policy that you adopt or not. So it is multi-criteria that they use, so it's slightly more sophisticated than the UK government, who mostly have used cost-benefit analysis. But in the European Union, there is also this 12-week public consultation strategy on the internet. But the public is then supposed to understand the output from the models, which are black boxes, and even the people who develop them don't really know what's gone into them because they've been developed over the last 25 years by various different people. So a full understanding of the assumptions that go into the model is missing. So the public's not going to understand that. They're then asked to look at it over a 3-month period, understand these big models, understand the output of these policies, and come up with consultations. So it's good, they want public consultation, but it's not the best way of communicating and engaging with the public. It's all online. So just as a bit of background in terms of who we spoke to, so we went out and tried to interview people to ask them, how do you use these models? What do you understand the models are telling you? What do you understand about the maths that's going into them? And actually we did this mostly in the European Union, but also in Brazil, China, India, and across the UK government to try and understand the differences between how these models are used, because similar models are used around the world. And with some of these big think tanks and a lot of the policymakers within the European Commission, so some of the sort of political leaders, but a lot of the actual people on the ground using the model or interpreting the outputs, plus the people who developed the models themselves, or at least using them in running this policy analysis. So our overall findings, so the things that we found, and this is basically what the European Commission was saying. So they were very honest. We might have been slightly surprised at how honest they were. But basically, we trust modelers. We trust what you're telling us. We trust what is coming out of your models. We don't really question any of the assumptions that are going in. So we're given model results. We have no space to actually pose questions about what the model results are telling us, why they're telling us that, what the assumptions are. Modelers are telling us they completely listen to what the policymakers want, manipulate the maths underlying it to give them the answers that they're being asked for. So they're being asked by policymakers to say, is this policy good or bad? They get judgment about whether they think the policy should be good or bad. As we all know, you can develop a mathematical model to tell you whatever answer you want if you really want to, especially when you're looking at these big behaviour change type initiatives across something like the European Union. So the modelers are designing things because they want to be paid and they want to continue those relationships with the policymakers to give them, the policymakers, what they want and what they need. It's really important, and the interpretation of this, the people who keep on going back, is that the presentation is key. So senior decision makers are only given the information they want to see because that's what they keep on asking for. So for example, on decision makings around big energy transformation. So why do we not have huge renewable sector across the whole of the European Union? Is because politicians want to know how much it costs. And so that's what they're seeing. So they're usually seeing big, this is going to cost you this much, and they try and tweak it, and this is how we bring the costs down. They're very rarely shown, and here are all the benefits you can get. You can get new industries, you can get export industries, you can get investments, you can create jobs. Those are slightly more complicated, so they only have time for the first graph, which is how much is this going to cost us. So the importance of that kind of narrative and discussion is really important. The other thing which they seem to be unaware of, the modelers were much more aware of it and the think tanks much more aware of it, is the bias in the models. So there's a bias in two ways. One is towards the existing technology. So where do you get data from so you can train your models, so you can look and validate your models? It's on what's going on at the moment. So there's a bias towards how we understand the current system and also the existing models. And in the existing models, that's how do we have an economy that works the way it does today. So we don't have a high innovation economy, and all our assumptions are around this sort of linear trajectory of growth without really any radical transformation. So we don't have a set of equations that go into these models that allow us to capture radical transformation and shifts in public opinion, shifts in technology deployment, so we can't model them. And therefore we don't advise that that's a good thing to do or that it's possible. There are now new sets of models, especially agent-based models and things like that, which are starting to do that, but they're not the models that people are using because they don't produce the same graph that looks exactly the same. So there's this sort of translation problem, communication problem, which is right in the middle of it. And interestingly, when we started talking to the policymakers around, so how much of this model do you use, and what do you actually want to get out of this modelling? So this is the sort of policy modelling relies a lot on this qualitative information as much as quantitative information around the direction of travel. So partly there's a lot of ideology that goes into development of policy, and the modelling fits around that and doesn't really challenge the ideology, or at least it fits into the qualitative narrative that's been put on top of it. So there is a lot of qualitative information that's used to make the policy, mostly on the policy side, less so on the modelling side, and we've been trying to see how we can get the modellers to think more qualitatively so they understand why things are driven in the way they are by the policymakers. And the main conclusion that we had was that models are not shaping policy, but they are there to confirm assumptions. So policymakers say, we want to do this, please could you build us a model to tell us we're doing the right thing. We'll then have your report that we'll never read, we'll stick it on the desk, and when someone challenges, we'll say, well, this person told us it was all right. So they are definitely being used to help confirm the things that the policymakers want to do. That was coming quite clearly, and they were quite open about that in the European Commission. It seems to be very similar in most of the governments and most of the policy circles that we spoke to. Some are slightly less hesitant about owning that quite as clearly as some of the people in the European Commission were, but that seems to be the way they are. So one of the things we're trying to understand is models are great. We need to absolutely use them to do these big system changes. But how do we get new models in? How do we get new information in? How do we allow this plethora of new maths to be used to make better decisions about big radical transformations? I spend a lot of time working with the Institute of Actuaries, doing tail risk stuff. So I do a lot around the apocalypse and the end of the world and how we can collapse society, especially in food systems at the moment. We have a big project around will civil unrest happen in the UK in the next 5 to 10 years? And the answer to that is possibly. Not no, but possibly. That's funded by DEFRA. And it's really interesting when you talk to DEFRA about things like that, about conflict. Could you see civil unrest in the UK? And they go, no, of course you can't. And you go, well, here are all the risks in food. So there's climate change, there's biodiversity, nature loss, pollinator loss, cybersecurity, transport, strikes, investment. There's also Russia invades Ukraine. There's droughts in the US that take out wheat baskets. There's floods in China. There are so many risks. There's trade policy, there's Brexit. There's so many risks that could undermine our food system. On top of that, we have a community in the UK that has no trust in government, is food poor, is insecure, and has rioted in the streets in London. And so when we talk to government and say, is civil unrest possible, and they say no, so the measure we're using is the London riots across the cities in the UK. People were arrested. If you do that, it's 10 times worse than that. That is plausible given the amount of risks that we're seeing. We started this project 1.5 years ago. The one risk we didn't have in there was the US invading Europe. We did a bit in the Daily Express last week about the impact of the US if they actually invade Greenland. That gets rid of all international norms. It gets rid of all of the things that we rely on for a stable import food industry. World Trade Organization rules go out the window. So we are slightly at risk. And the actuaries are quite interested in trying to model some of this tail risk, trying to model some of these plausible scenarios. Lloyd's of London, we did a report for them in 2014 around what would happen if Russia invaded Ukraine, what would happen to wheat prices, could we see civil unrest in different countries, mostly around North Africa, how does that cascade through, what's the plausible and the plausible outcomes of that, how does that cascade through. So these sorts of things are really useful, but you need different sorts of models, you need different sorts of knowledge to be used to make those assumptions. And actuaries have relied on standard economic modelling for a long time. There's a group that are now trying to look at planetary tipping points and boundaries on what does climate sensitivity mean for some of their assumptions going forward. So there's a lot of reports coming out from them about how to do maths differently within the finance sector as well. So just very quickly, I suppose the key output for us, and again, it's a report that sits on a shelf, it's in the UK Treasury shelf, no one's going to ever read it, but we're trying to continue this sort of engagement. Essentially, we came up with 10 principles compared to principles that they used before. So the old principle in UK Treasury was policy models and assessment are neutral. You use maths, you will get a neutral answer, and that's the best answer you can have. The new principle is know your bias. Use maths, but know what it's telling you and know why it's telling you that. And the why it's telling you that is really important. And the case study we use is the 2030 renewable energy targets that had models around biofuels in particular, and it told them what they wanted to know, and it did create a lot of problems around the renewable energy targets because the assumptions that went in drove you in a particular direction. So we do try and just as sort of an example of then get this out there, so in terms of the public and government consultation, so we did open the European Commission's Just Transition Platform Conference alongside the commissioners to talk about this. So it's to try and get it out to not just the people who know that it's happening, but also that wider community that can make some change, and engaging with policymakers, the ministers, the commissioners at the European Commission, really important, but also engaging with the public so that they can know how to engage with these big consultations when they're asked, you know, what do you think about this policy that we've got all this information and data for? How do you think this is going to change the way you, you know, your life? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? So helping them to understand what's going into these sort of models is really important. That's me.